Hi Year 10, welcome to Biomes 11. Yes, I know we are actually only up to Biomes 10, but I think if we do Biomes 11, it will make Biomes 10 a little bit easier to understand. So today we're going to be talking about the biophysical interactions, what they are and how they exist on the Great Barrier Reef, and looking at the key term of analyze. Ecosystems don't exist on their own, just as is. They exist because of a variety of interactions that occur between the biotic and abiotic, or living and non-living features. The four spheres that we're going to talk about are the lithosphere, atmosphere, biosphere, and hydrosphere. And all of these spheres work together to create the Earth as we know it. A change in one sphere may impact the next. For example, if there was a change in the amount of precipitation or rain occurring that works within the atmosphere, then there might be more erosion of topsoil in the lithosphere that runs off into the hydrosphere. So we have a three-way interaction here that occurs. Any changes that are natural or human-induced can lead to issues with the interactions between the spheres. It's really important when we think about this topic that we don't think about any sphere kind of on its own, because that wouldn't be an interaction. We're talking about biophysical interactions, which means how they interact and how they engage with other spheres around them. Let's start by looking at some definitions for each of the spheres. So the atmosphere really is a combination of gas and particles that surround the Earth. They are the invisible layer around the Earth that kind of traps heat in and where all sorts of weather events occur. The lithosphere is all about the hard outer shell. It's the mantle and the rock that encompasses the surface of the Earth. The hydrosphere are the interconnections of all the water storage, and it very closely links with the atmosphere and lithosphere. The biosphere is that adjacent zone. It's between the lithosphere and the atmosphere, and it comprises of all the living and non-living elements of the Earth. So on the side here, I've got a little picture to try and demonstrate that for you. So we've got the hard rock of the lithosphere, the greenhouse gases or the atmosphere, we've got the hydrosphere of all the water, and then the biosphere might be a tree or an animal that exists within the ecosystem. Now we know a little bit about each of the spheres, we're going to apply them specifically to the Great Barrier Reef. Remember, you will also need to be able to apply these spheres to your own ecosystem, so it's important you have a really good understanding of what each of them are. When we talk about the atmosphere in regards to the Great Barrier Reef, we're really looking at it being a source of climatic factors. It involves things like the temperature and the amount of rainfall that occurs within the ecosystem, and we know that the Great Barrier Reef lies within the tropical band, which means it has two distinct seasons, wet and dry. It also lies in the cyclone zone, and cyclones are caused by intense low pressure systems that hit tropical maritime air masses, and they cause then unstable conditions to occur. We know from previous lessons that tropical cyclones cause significant damage to the reef. They break apart coral, they cause large storm surges with the waves, and they can rip apart and damage the coral beds that exist. It can also lead to corals being buried by sediment because the cyclones tear through all the sand and stir it up, which increases turbidity in the water. It can also lead to events like flooding if there's more rainfall than would normally be occurring. So we can think here about some of these interactions occurring with other spheres. The sediment is part of the lithosphere, so the atmosphere interacts with the lithosphere when cyclones increase sediment, and the atmosphere interacts with the lithosphere when there's increased amounts of water that flood from other water sources within the ecosystem. So remember, when we talk about the spheres, we have to talk about them interacting with another sphere. We should never be talking about one sphere just on its own. In regards to the hydrosphere, we know it's very closely linked to the atmosphere because weather is so important in the Great Barrier Reef. Hydrosphere refers to all the water that exists, and because it is an aquatic ecosystem, there's a lot of water to be dealt with. Coral reefs grow best where there's high wave energy. This is because nutrients are able to be carried in the waves to help feed the animals that live on the coral reef. So this is an example of the hydrosphere interacting with the biosphere. We also know that powerful currents exist around the Great Barrier Reef, such as the East Australian Current, and they move water and nutrients across the reef during the wet season, promoting more biodiversity, another link with the biosphere. Really, when we're talking about the hydrosphere, the most linked spheres will be the atmosphere because of the weather and the rain and the cyclones, and the biosphere because of the current movements. In terrestrial or land-based ecosystems, the lithosphere determines the type of soil that occurs. So for your own ecosystem, you might be looking at the type of soil that that is present in your ecosystem? Is it loamy? Is it sandy? Is it silty? What is the composition of the soil? And that soil composition will determine what sort of plants can grow there. It will also determine how loose the soil is and how at risk your ecosystem might be from things like landslides or mudslides. It also is important because it will determine the way the food web interacts, which is a link with the biosphere. Whether or not decomposers exist within the lithosphere, within the soil, will determine again how plants and animals can grow and feed. So there's a really clear crossover between the lithosphere and the biosphere. In the aquatic ecosystem of the Great Barrier Reef, the lithosphere is more about the coral skeletons that exist, along with some of the sand and sediment that sits on the bottom of the reef. The reef was formed by corals that are weathered and distributed across the reef, and it's the limestone that exists as part of these corals as their skeletal backbone that creates a solid foundation for future reefs to grow upon. Sediments like sand and mud can run off from further up the ecosystem due to things like farming or increased rainfall, and they can wash into the Great Barrier Reef. This increases turbidity, decreases the amount of light that can penetrate, and prevents corals from photosynthesizing. The increase in sediment can also smother or suffocate the reef. So there's a really clear link here between the lithosphere and the atmosphere when the weather conditions determine this runoff. The biosphere is all about animals and plants that exist in an ecosystem. We consider animals and plants to be one of two types of organisms, autotrophic or heterotrophic. Autotrophic organisms are self-sufficient. They use solar, water, and wind energy to produce energy and nutrients. They tend to be plants. Heterotrophic are organisms that require another organism to survive. So there are carnivores, our decomposers, our omnivores, and within the biosphere, we have our food chains and our food webs begin to exist. And we know from previous lessons that if any part of the food web is taken away because of either a natural or a human-induced change, it can damage the whole function of the ecosystem. So if we, for example, were to lose the primary producers from this food web, then all of these other animals above it on the food chain would have no food source. Okay, so it's really important we consider the biosphere and how it provides life for the ecosystems. Specifically within the Great Barrier Reef, the main organism we're talking about is coral. Coral is the most prevalent organism, with over 330 species of coral being found on the reef. The northern section of the reef is the area with the most biodiversity. We know that the predominant structure of the Great Barrier Reef is rock as part of the lithosphere, but the reef is a living organism, and a lot of those living aspects of it come from the coral polyps. There's a picture of what a coral polyp looks like just on the side here for you. They're very primitive organisms that exist mostly of limestone, which is a type of calcium carbonate, and really just have a digestive sac or stomach. And what happens is the tentacles on the outside, they collect different plankton and other sort of organisms that float in the water, and they feed off that to grow. What else happens here is that zooxanthellae, I'm never saying that right, but this word here, zooxanthellae, exists within these polyps as well. And what happens is they are the organism that provide the colour to the coral. So it's once a coral is bleached, this is the organism that is expelled and disappears and turns the coral white. Okay, there's a symbiotic relationship that exists between the organism and the coral polyp because they provide each other with nutrients and things like that. As the coral polyps grow, they do end up breeding and they release their sperm and eggs during different times of the year, and they pollinate and float down to other structures on the reef to grow more coral polyps along the reef. So they're a very, very important part of the biosphere. Apart from coral, the Great Barrier Reef has many other species that exist as well, from fish to turtles to sharks to whales, other sea grasses, things like that. And it's really important that these creatures have the right nutrients to exist. So the right nutrients that exist within the water are often present because of the atmosphere and those weather events that move nutrients in and out of the hydrosphere. So again, we can link all the spheres together here because we have to remember to keep talking about those interactions. The key term for your question today is analyse. Now, analyse probably is the trickiest key term that we do in social science. Analyse has quite a long definition, but you do need to know all the parts of it. So to analyse means to identify components and the relationships between them and to draw out implications or consequences. It's really looking at the short-term and the long-term consequences of a relationship. Now, analyse is quite a good key term to do for this topic because you're already doing the first part by default. When we talk about biophysical interactions, we're talking about each sphere, that's the components, but the relationship between them is as soon as we start talking about the word interactions. So as soon as we say how one sphere interacts with another, we have done the first part. What you then need to do is draw out or show what the impact or the consequence of that interaction occurring is. What is the consequence of the interaction between the hydrosphere and the atmosphere when it comes to weather and climate? What is the implication of the interaction between the biosphere and the lithosphere when it comes to coral polyps? You need to make sure you can draw out what the effect is, not just state the relationship. Analyse questions tend to be longer questions, they tend to be worth more marks. So your question that you're answering today is another longer question requiring about 22 lines from you. We've given you some sentence starters and connecting terms again to help you think about your phrasing, and it's really important you try and integrate some of these into your answer to make sure that you definitely are doing those implications, because that's what students often find most difficult when it comes to doing an analyse question. This part, the first part, like I said, you'll do very naturally. You'll talk about the components in the relationship, but it's making sure you draw out that so what. Why is this interaction important? What are the implications, perhaps both short and long term, of that relationship? Okay, as I said, one question today, question 25 on your worksheet, 22 lines. Please make sure you try and hit that line count. If you don't, I might ask you to resubmit. Let me know by submitting done to your due work so I can check your answers. Then I'll send you the sample answers for you to mark your own work.